Hello there, and welcome to Hobbies of All, Master of None. I have here a 1/12 scale model by Tamiya, the Kawasaki Ninja ZX-12R from the 2000s. I've built these types of models before, but I'm going to take a little step higher than what I've done more than 10 years ago and do it the quote-unquote proper way. I'll show you what I mean. Let's first have a look at the contents of the box. We have a couple of pieces of paper. One is how to build the model, which I'm going to explain later. One is where all the water slide decals go, and the instructions of how to build this thing. Then we get to the parts of the model, some of which you can tell immediately what they are. The water slide decals and shiny reflective stickers, as well as some screws and a tiny screwdriver. So the concept of building this model is pretty simple. Pick the pieces according to the instructions and glue it up together, like how I previously built these models. The next level up is to start cleaning up the pieces, as you get a little plastic nub from where the parts were injection molded. You can do this by using a pair of nippers, or sprue cutters, or side cutters, whatever those cutters are called. And to further clean it up, you can use some sandpaper or sanding sticks to sand it down maybe from about 400 grit up to about 1200 grit. That should take care of any nut marks. What I've not done before is painting the model. Now this means that I would prepare the parts as described previously, then prime it, and then paint it by using a paintbrush, an airbrush, or a spray can. I did get an airbrush last year for this project, and yes, I waited a year since I received this gift for my birthday and got all the materials ready. I just had so many projects that I wanted to do. As this is the first time me doing this type of painting, I can give you some tips and tricks I've picked up along the way so that you don't make these same mistakes. And the first one is have proper ventilation, and if you can, spray paint outside. Now this seems pretty obvious and even says on the spray can, but in my infinite wisdom of wanting to save some money, I didn't get an extractor fan and immediately regret it when the spray back from the primer hits me in the face.
3 days later.
Another tip is when priming, make sure that you don't use too thick of a coat, otherwise you could end up with a pool of primer in the crevices, ruining the details. Man, that extractor is loud. After priming the parts comes painting. The instruction actually tells you what color to use for the most representative and realistic recreation of the real life bike. I did take some shortcuts and liberties though. For example, instead of getting chrome silver and titanium silver, I only got chrome silver, and the reason for this mostly is cost. Each little bottle of paint was about £4 or £5, so I've spent a good £60 on this project before I even started. And I probably don't care enough about the subtle differences of colour as long as the colour is different. For example, I'm not going to tell the difference between matte black, gloss black and semi-gloss black when they're just on the model and the lighting's not very good. This is also the first time for me to use an airbrush, so I just go off with what I know from looking at videos and try my best. It seems that the paint I'm using is already pre-thinned, so I don't actually need to use the paint thinner here, but hindsight is 2020, which is a dumpster fire, so I'm only using a thinner on these initial parts. I did use thinners later on for metallic paints, and also for some reason I didn't get white, so I have to use acrylic paint and then paint thinner to try and get an even spray. I did sometimes have problems using the airbrush when I pull the trigger back and there's no spray. I think that's because I haven't cleaned the airbrush properly in between paints and it's getting stuck. But most of the time it works beautifully, giving me a smooth, even finish. Sometimes with the parts, you need to add some extra details or a different section with a different color. Depending on how big that area is, I would just apply it using a paintbrush. Or mask off the area where I don't want that new color and airbrush, spray or paint over it. I'm not super good with this, as my hand painting and masking tape skills isn't the best, and there would be some leaks through the tape, or my hand would just shake and accidentally paint over something I didn't want to. In that case, I would just go and touch it up with a paintbrush. Once all the painting is done, then you can spray it with clear coat. I went with gloss instead of matte, a subtle difference, and it mostly depends on what kind of finish you want. After the clear coat has dried, you can apply water slide decals or stickers onto it. With water slide decals, you first need to cut out the decal, then soak it with water until they detach from the paper. Then you slide it onto the part using a pair of tweezers, or here I use a clean paintbrush, or my fingers. They are a bit fragile and floppy, and they can sometimes stick to each other, so do be careful or you might pierce or break it. For big pieces, I find it best to first apply a couple of drops of water onto the part to help slide the decal in place. Then carefully soak up the excess water without moving it. I also like to apply an extra clear coat to protect it once it has dried. So that's really how you prepare the parts for assembly: cut, sand, prime, paint, decal, and clear coat. Once it is fully dried, you can start putting the different pieces together for sub-assembly. 2 tips here. 1. The paint is quite soft, so make sure that it is fully dried before you attempt to assemble it. Otherwise, you might dent the paint. And secondly, the plastic cement gluing the pieces together can dissolve the paint. So if possible, do the glue up before painting in sub-assemblies, otherwise be very careful where you're putting that glue brush. And that's pretty much how to build the model. You just repeat the process until all the parts are painted and assembled. This particular model, we start off with the engine, the chassis, then putting the chassis and the engine together. It was a bit of a tight squeeze to get the engine in there and get it aligned for the screws, but we got there in the end. The rear subframe assembly, which has the rear wheel, the rear swing arm with the rear suspension, the little bits on the left side like the pegs and chain guard, the front fork assembly, which includes the front wheels, handlebars, front suspension and dashboard. This particular sub-assembly took the longest for me as it has lots of small parts as well as lots of hoses connections. The hoses essentially are thin rubber tubes, and the fragile nature of them as well as the finished painting part being slippery with the clear coat applied means that it gave me a lot of headache to try and get those sorted. I do have to use a combination of trying to stretch the rubber with a pair of tweezers as well as glue to try and put them in place. The seat, the fuel tank, the lights, the exhaust, which came chrome plated, meaning that I had to scrape off the coating to apply the glue to adhere them together. The little bits on the right side with the foot pegs and the rear master brake cylinder as well, which I had to give up on one of the rubber hoses as it was just impossible to attach. Final details like the number plate and little knobs on the side for the luggage attachments. And finally the fairing. With the windscreen, wing mirrors and indicators. All in all, this took me about 36 hours, so a couple of weekends. And here's a look at the final assembly. It's not too bad. Hopefully the next time I do a model like this, I can improve on certain things, like painting consistency and the details. But most importantly, I need to optimize the workflow of this. It is quite inefficient to keep switching paints and waiting for paint to dry as well. I'll have a think on how to do that before I start my next model. Well, I hope you liked this video. I do have a couple more puzzles and model kits to do. Check out my other videos if you're interested, and I'll see you in the next video of Hobbies of 4, Master of None. Bye!